Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us, slightly delayed for this second issue briefing of the Day 2 of the annual meeting of the Global Future Council's 2018. Welcome online viewers as well. Glad to have you here, and also welcome to our visitors and viewers on social media. Those of you that don't know issue briefings, maybe a brief explanation is required. 30 minutes is not a long period of time to discuss one of the most cutting issues on the global news agenda, but we're going to try to do our best. This means that, along with having world-class experts, we have to try to keep as much debate and conversation going as possible. We encourage as many questions as you can and as much disagreement and discord as you can possibly find. We want to get to the truth, and we want to try to nail down as much as we can on this highly dynamic and most topical of subjects. My name is Oliver Cann. I work at the World Economic Forum. I'm very glad to be joined on my left by Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economic Policy of National University of Singapore. Arantxa Gonzalo-Laya from my hometown of Switzerland, Geneva in Switzerland, Executive Director of the International Trade Center. And Mark Wu, you're a Stimson Professor of Law at Harvard Law School in the USA today. Now today, I've been looking at the Google News for trade news and for updates. It's gone a bit quiet, hasn't it? I've taken an amateur interest in this, and I was in China for our meeting on science and technology in September, where Premier Li Keqiang made an initial response to the decision by the US administration to raise tariffs, or to indicate their intent to raise tariffs. Since then, there's a little bit, the trade war has gone a little bit below the radar in terms of the public debate, at least. I think that's maybe a good place to start with this conversation, and to try to figure out what exactly is happening and how is it going to play out. We've had now about a month to absorb the news, which was not entirely unexpected anyway, that tariffs were to go up. So where are we at the moment? And Mark, I'm encouraging you to start.
If I may, I think we're in a bit of a holding pattern in anticipation of the Trump-Xi get-together later this month in Buenos Aires. So I think we've had several shots across the bow, and now we've had a couple of punches blown. So I think both sides are taking stock to see, is there some room to find some path towards an exit ramp here? It's unclear where that is, but clearly there's a lot of preparatory work being done for that discussion to see whether that leads to some off-ramp or a further escalation come January 1st.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, that's perfectly fine. So, no, just to add on to what Mark mentioned, well, of course, there is a stock taking, and that's, in a sense, good news. But I think it's also important to note that this is not just China-specific. There are a bunch of tariffs which have come up on Chinese products, but there are another bunch of tariffs which have been just very product-specific. So you have this coming out of Section 232 investigations, which first went up on steel and aluminium, and there are more that are expected out of investigations that are ongoing in the case of auto components and automobiles. So I think there are two broad divisions to the story. I mean, one part of it is how much of de-escalation can happen in the US-China relationship to produce an end or work towards an end towards what is very specifically targeted towards China, but insofar as the rest of it concerned. And let's not forget that that's how it all began. It's all started from the steel and aluminium tariffs. So whether that's going to go away in a hurry or not, unfortunately, I'm personally not at a point to take a very optimistic view on this at this stage, because I don't think the imperatives which led the US to that kind of an action have completely ceased.
Well, I would say that the fact that trade is not making the headlines this week does not mean that trade is not being affected by the measures that have been taken in the past months. And when you ask businesses that at the end of the day are the ones that are on the front line of all these measures, they tell you that they are already suffering, that they are postponing investment decisions because all these measures and countermeasures are creating a lot of uncertainty, that they are actually not sure about what is happening, which, by the way, we see in a way translated into stock markets nervousness. Beyond that, we are also seeing a number of producers passing on the increased costs of these tariffs on to consumers. So it's not because we don't talk about it this week that people out there are not suffering the consequences of all this flurry of unilateral measures being taken left, right, and center. And what is worrying for me is two things. One is that this is a disease that spreads very quickly. That once a big one does it, many others feel that they've got license to do that. And the second thing that worries me is that the biggest impact will be on the base of the pyramid. The biggest impact will be on those that are smaller and incapable of absorbing extra costs, and this is 99% of our economic tissues. So I think we have to be careful about next steps, bearing in mind 99% of our economies.
Thanks, Roger. I want to come back to the winners and losers, and we're here in possibly the most globally integrated trading nation, Dubai, of course. There are people in the audience from nations that are heavily export dependent, of course, and I want to know what the wider ramifications are. But first of all, Mark, you mentioned a pathway towards exit. What does that look like when you're dealing with a very mercantilist system, a very zero-sum approach to waging this trade dispute?
Well, I think one of the things that's underlying the tensions here is certainly there's the economic tensions due to the deficit and so forth, but more beyond that, I think the issue of the national security concerns. And in particular, this is a clash of two different views of economic systems. And whether or not you can find ways to reconcile those differences because the stakes are so large. So we're talking about issues about different modes of managing digital trade, different views towards subsidies, different views towards what the role of overcapacity is and its externalities on other economies and so forth. So I think there's one path certainly where both leaders say, you know, we got the message. We're going to both try to do some things to sort of take a step back, but we're going to recognize these types of differences and just try to deal with them. But I think there is another view, which is to say the security stakes are too large, and really our economies have grown too interdependent in some ways, and I think there are some who are pushing for more, the word today is decoupling. And so there really is two different types of views here, and it will depend on which of these prevail on both sides of the two biggest economic trading powers right now.
Thanks. I encourage you all to chip in. But Amitendu, who is winning the moment?
Nobody. And there's obviously not bound to be any winners in this. I mean, if any kind of result or outcome of this is interpreted as a victory, then I'm afraid it's going to be elusive and very short-term in nature. But just to expound on what Mark alluded to, I suppose the problem out here is that the US actions on tariffs began getting rationalized on national security grounds. And this is with respect to the damage inflicted on the domestic industry. And that's how the national security came into being. So there are two reasons for which this might just spread, as Arantxa alluded to. One is that there could be more countries which could take to doing this down the line and start acting on imbalanced trade relationships as grounds for national security exercise. The second problem is that if this goes on, it's been pretty clearly established that the multilateral rules are insufficient for tackling this. So as a result of that, there's no stopping unilateral action on part of countries if they want to adhere to it. So that's dangerous. And if that spreads, then this kind of becomes a very vicious form of contagion where countries just start acting unilaterally in a space which is defended by sovereign interests. So I suppose that's a serious part of it, and honestly, there can't be any winner in this war.
And of course, everybody in this building almost, so I'm sure would agree with that. We tend to take a view that global trade and investment is a win-win, but at the same time, you have a US administration which is emboldened by playing zero-sum game tactics. NAFTA has been renegotiated, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not a universally held view that this is a lose-lose situation.
Look, you mentioned the NAFTA negotiations. I'm just going to come back to the USMCA and point to certain parts of it. I'm not getting into the value content and so on and so forth. But if there are provisions like the Section 32 of that Act, which says that partners are not to get into FTAs with supposed non-market economies, quote unquote, that doesn't stop similar non-market economies from acting counter-retaliatory decisions, when they get into free trade agreements with other countries and implant clauses over there, so then what you're getting to see is too many vertical splits and bilateral splits across the world, and trade gets managed. I mean, trade doesn't function on the basis of markets, but it just gets conditioned according to a purely security-constrained prism and worldview.
Yeah, I want to briefly touch on this national security concern, because I think this is at the heart of a lot of what we are saying. Now, national security is an exception that exists in WTO rules that allows countries, when it's national security, capital S security, to pause from complying with the rules of international trade, to, in a way, have a bit of a escape clause. But it was thought as a security capital S. And this is why it's hardly been used in the history of international trade. Because there was an understanding that I restrain, you restrain, we don't have to use it. Because otherwise, we both understand, we all members of the organization understand this is such a huge hole that anything could go through it. Now, what we are seeing is a little bit less self-restraint in the understanding of what national security is. And of course, you have members of the WTO telling the US, allies in NATO telling the US, are we really a national security threat to the US? Are we really capital S? So it starts looking a little bit less about national security and more about what Mark alluded to, which is probably trying to deglobalize, trying to repatriate a number of value chains to your national territory. I'm not questioning the validity of this approach, but it is a problem for the international trading system, and it leads to a zero-sum game if everybody embarks in such a game of repatriating economic activity back to their nation, because this negates the very principle of international trade.
If I may add one further thought here, right? We're here at the World Economic Forum in Dubai with concerns about what the future global architecture looks like. But part of this is not just a failure of the trading system, but of the other parts of the architecture. And in particular, one of the things that I think is motivating the US concerns is the escalation about cyber espionage attacks. And the traditional rules of the game have always been differentiated on espionage for intelligence purposes as opposed for commercial purposes. But the breakdown of governance rules in that realm has had a spillover effect onto the trade regime. And so you have folks inside this administration saying, we need to be much more secure about the dual-use technologies, particularly when there aren't the similar rules in line about other modes of attack, and they have spillover onto commercial relationships. So I think these are all interlinked systems, and the failure of one part has implications for another, and as Arantxa pointed out, this can quickly then spill over onto further lines as well.
A couple of really interesting dynamics you mentioned there. Global architecture, of course, the theme of the annual meeting that we're here to hopefully develop some ideas about is the search for a global architecture sufficient to sustain and further global integration. And I'm really keen to know about the dynamic of deglobalization when it seems to be, especially within the organization I work for, a belief that global integration is going to happen whether we like it or not. But first, let's just see who has some questions to ask. Please put your hands up. Okay, let's try to go through them, all these three at a time. Sir, 4.
Yeah, my name's Kjell Louie. I'm from Monavisen in Denmark. All the focus have been on the US-China trade debacle, but the European Union has been blocking China's access to become a market economy in the WTO. The European Union has quite a few anti-dumping issues running with China, and as latest, the European Union has presented its proposal to reform the WTO, among others going away from the consensus principle. So even if this tariff war were to be subdued or end, we would still have major trading issues. So how should they be dealt with? Because if the WTO is not functioning due to the consensus principle, then what should be replacing it?
Okay, so the next one.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Anushka Vijayasinghe from Sri Lanka. A question to both Arantxa and Amitendu. It's around the implications for Asia, right? So there's a view that, the optimistic view is that this provides a whole lot of new opportunities for supply chains to move and new countries in this region to gain from it, accessing the US, folks moving out of China. Other views, like for example, the ADB chief economist saying, that may happen, but in the short run, it's going to be very dangerous. So I just want to get a sense from both of you, should we be optimistic or should we be pessimistic around the opportunities for the rest of Asia?
Great question. Pass the microphone along, please.
Okay, so let me raise one puzzle. The puzzle is that despite the trade war or tariff war, China export has rather increased, and in particular, surplus with US rather increased. How can you interpret this phenomenon?
Okay, and gentleman at the back.
Hi, just a question about cybersecurity. And Bloomberg a few weeks ago had a story about hacking in China and microchips implanted in motherboards. This raises the question of a possible disruption of supply chain in the technology sector. So I'd love to have your views on that.
Okay, let's get one more. And I think if we maybe spend 1 minute on each, if that's okay, because of timing. And the gentleman in the front row, okay.
So yeah, this is a question from the media. I'm from Zawiya. You spoke about the impact on the economies, and the Middle East is majority SMEs. Can that actually boost them, so that instead of focusing on export, they can actually focus on local consumption and hence grow their businesses? Thank you.
Okay, gentleman here.
Thank you. Yeah, so there was Nikkei columnist. Mark mentioned that there was exit, but it doesn't seem to be there was exit prepared by the US from China. So they're playing their own games. So just wondering if the rest of the world, how can we make an exit for them? And I was just wondering if the plural approach in Geneva, how does it work?
Okay, great questions, all of them. Should we start with Europe, because that's a it's a big elephant in the room. We've been talking far too much, arguably, about US and China.
No, I would say consensus is not the problem in the World Trade Organization. It's consensus among the top players in the league. Consensus is always, accused of being the reason why the WTO doesn't work. But I can tell you, having worked in the WTO, if the top 7 players play the ball, then the rest will align to that, because the 7 represent a certain center of gravity around which the rest of the members will gravitate. So let's not try to fix a problem with solutions that don't address the bottom line, which is the lack of consensus between 7 major, 6 major players to date 2. This is why we are focusing basically on the 2, on the basic principles of what the organization should deliver for them. SMEs and impact. Look, this is not about remaining at home. Many SMEs remain at home and they are not competitive, and they are not competitive because they remain at home. Trade for SMEs means competitiveness. Competitiveness means productivity, and productivity means better jobs, better paid jobs, and better working conditions. So normally a company gets stronger at home and then even stronger by trading abroad. This is why trade matters for SMEs, and this is why turbulence is bad for SMEs, especially today.
So let me tackle a couple of the questions. One question was about the China export data. So I think there's 2 phenomena that are coming into place here. One is we've seen a currency effect. So I think the currency effect is playing out here. The other is there's the threat of the tariffs escalating on January 1st. So I think what we're seeing in the monthly data is still some front loading. Some of that took place before the 10% tariffs came into place, but I think there's also some front loading that's happening there as well. And then the other part about cybersecurity, supply chain disruptions, certainly I think there's much more caution in the supply chains now, and there's awareness of this and wanting to think about diversifying the supply chains. But all of that takes time because you do need to reconfigure lines, look at testing out multiple suppliers and so forth. So I think we're still at the early stages of looking at how supply chains might be disrupted, which also then has implications for others outside of this, or whether or not this is actually an opportunity. It may be for some players, but you really have to have a certain set of comparative advantages in order to really be able to substitute in that. And I fear for many SMEs in particular, right, you don't have that. It's very difficult to sort of plug yourself into a supply chain, particularly for complex electronic products. Last question about the plurilaterals. I think we're still at an early stage of those discussions about how outside of the big two, whether or not they could get towards some form of a consensus on that. Certainly these discussions are helpful, but like any other international institutions, I think these move along at a slow pace. If they could get to some sort of a consensus, and that's a big if, that may help to sort of cabin this. But I think the political ramifications are for the likely short-term pathways from which we should consider the ongoing trade war.
Let me address the impact for Asia. I'm aware of this view that there is this substantive conversation going on that because exports out of China would encounter higher tariffs, there is a possibility of trade shifting to the other side. Well, I'm not denying the possibility, but I think let's also look at it from a business perspective. This is not going to be automatic. It's not going to be one-on-one. If there is a business relocation out of higher costs, that's likely to move to locations which have been able to achieve substantive trade facilitation. That is, which are locations by themselves, which qualify as good locations for business and outward-oriented production. So it's not going to be something which is to be taken for granted. There are countries that are probably going to have some opportunities in chipping in deeper in some of the existing supply chains, but these are going to take time. These are obviously going to take time and span out over the medium term. Coming to this last question of what the rest of the world can do. Look, I think the US-China relationship is something which significantly affects the rest of the world in a very substantive fashion. But then that rest of the world is also not very small. That's pretty big. So one way of looking at this issue is that if the rest of the world can arrive at measures between themselves which enables more trade, two things happen. One is more trade is obviously generated. There's still scope for a lot of trade being generated outside the US-China domain. So that's a possibility. The second is it sends a signal that, look, we believe in trade and there is the possibility of trade being pushed forward. And the good part is, I think this is where I'd want to capture positive stories, that there are countries which are actually committed to trade as a beneficial instrument for long-term growth. I mean, it's just in the recent past that two small economies, small when I say purely in terms of size, Singapore and Sri Lanka have worked out a challenging free trade agreement between them, which has become operational. Asia is moving towards the RCEP. The EU and Japan have agreed on a FTA. So there are more such occasions. Australia and Indonesia are talking about a free trade agreement. So there's a lot that is happening, and I don't think the US-China trade development should be taken to interpret the fact that the world has lost its faith in trade. That's not the case. It's probably episodic. There's probably a lot of reservation arising about trade, but nonetheless, systems and establishments are trying to work around these challenges.
Arantxa, you had one more comment to make.
Yeah, on this last question, I think what the rest of the world should do is help build a bridge between the US and China. This is a bit what Japan, the European Union, Canada, and many others are doing. Do not, in my view, they feel that they cannot let it, it's too big to leave it just for the two of them. At the same time, they should be trying to tease the two out of their corner and build a bridge that will, in a way, build a solution for the future.
I beg to continue the session by 1 or 2 more minutes, if I may, just because there are so many questions I want to continue. I keep going back to the theme of our annual meeting. It's about shaping a new global architecture to withstand the changes we're going through in the world. You're all on the Trade and Investment Global Future Council. How do we do that?
Let me give it a try. I think we built a system that was too reliant on one player to be the locomotive because we were living in a more, let's say, unipolar world. We are moving to a much more multipolar world, and this means we need more locomotives. We need more countries, not only to say that they are now part of this more multipolar world, but also to put coal in their engines, to pull the system and move it forward. So more stakeholders, but more stakeholders that behave in a responsible way to pull the system forward.
I'll add 2 more things to build on what Arantxa is saying. I think we've lived in an era of enormous technology disruption. We have other lingering disruptions on the horizon. These rules were written in the early to mid 1990s. They clearly need to be updated for the digital realm, but this is not just for the trade architecture. This is also for all of the other elements of the internet architecture, particularly when internet governance looks very different across the 2 major powers here, not to mention the EU, Japan, and others. The other thing I'll add is part of the backlash against globalization is because so many people in advanced economies, but also in developing countries, feel left out. The rising tide did not lift all boats. So we have a lot of work to do, both domestically as well as across countries, to make sure that growth is much more inclusive.
When we look at any system of rules, the global trade rules, the WTO rules, I think the fundamental assumption has always been that all members of the system take the rules as given. The problem arises when countries try to act as rule setters individually. The market doesn't have a space to function within those set of rules. And this is where the message has to go, that look, if the global architecture has to survive, it must survive on the basis of rules being taken as given. If countries try to adjust those rules on the basis of balance of power relationships or purely political motives, then no architecture can survive.
Thank you. I'm feeling generous. Please, take the microphone.
So my question is about the new trade order, and I'm curious, are you seeing the Belt and Road Initiative as kind of a competition or complementary to the existing trade order built around the US and Europe?
Yes, in Europe. Who's going to take that one on? Mark.
The Belt and Road Initiative is still evolving. But one thing that is clear is that there is a tremendous infrastructure need within Asia, both on land and on sea, to connect markets which traditionally have not been connected. So I think in that sense, that element is a positive complementarity. There may be spillover effects into other domains, whether we're talking about debt for developing countries, whether we're talking about environmental, and so on and so forth. So I think those are systemic impacts that remain yet to be seen, because they are choices that decision makers will make about how they're going to govern the other elements of what comes out of the BRI.
Let me also add to that. I think bursts in connectivity are great. I mean, as far as supply of public goods and infrastructure are concerned. Asia is an infrastructure deficient region, and this is going to step into areas where infrastructure is required. The bigger question is that, is this connectivity going to fashion trade? Is it going to dictate the terms of trade, the character of trade? If that happens, then, well, again, I mean, it's not market anymore. It's just the connectivity design and the issues connected with that connectivity, which is going to shape a particular feature of trade, which might be driven by non-market factors, which might be driven by strategic issues, geopolitical issues, funding issues. That's probably not desirable. But having said that, this needs to be looked at both sides.
Thanks. I forgot to say I have to have a last question. Sorry, guys. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of global trade to continue lifting and driving growth and development?
I am activistic.
Should have expected that one.
No, I don't think there's any dispute over that, because I think whichever periods of history we look into, I mean, trade has always been a contributory factor, a virtuous contributing factor to global growth. It's documented for having delivered. It might not have delivered in a uniform fashion for everybody, for all communities. That's where our role becomes important. Just to plug these gaps and see where the results can be better. But I think the question of trade being important insofar as global and national progress is concerned, there can't be any disputes over that.
Oliver, I promise you I'm not punting on your question, but I would say I'm both, right? If you look at the two large trading powers, right, there clearly are geopolitical as well as economic systems that are clashing here. So in that sense, I think there are costs to be absorbed by the system that we've ignored for the last 25 years. But on the other hand, I think despite that, technology provides a lot of opportunities for a lot more people to tap into this, and human beings are intrinsically entrepreneurial. They're going to find a way around all of this. So that leaves me some room for optimism despite the clashes ahead.
So that is 1.5 against half on the pessimistic note. What about you guys? Let's have a show of hands. Who's optimistic? See, panels are normally more optimistic than audiences. I've noticed that in my experiences.
But better than what we thought.
Better than what you're really. So you've given the game away now. You're expecting much less, much more pessimism. What a great session. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us here in the room and watching us live online.